Every day we move through systems of power that other people created. Power can often be an uncomfortable topic. In a democracy, power is supposed to reside with the people. Power can often feel dirty or evil, but it is no more inherently good or evil than fire or physics. It just exists. Power is the ability to decide who will have access to resources, the capacity to direct or influence the behavior of others, oneself, or the course of events. It is the ability to make others do what you would have them do. It's who gets to determine the rules of the game. This is in all arenas of life, from family to the workplace to our relationships. Learning how power operates is the key to being effective, being taken seriously, and not being taken advantage of. Today we're focusing on civic power, getting a community to make the choices and take the actions that you want. There are 6 sources of civic power. Physical force, the capacity for violence. Control by the means of force, whether it be the police or a militia. This is power at its most primal. Wealth. Money gives you the ability to buy results and the ability to buy almost any other kind of power. State action. Government. The use of law and bureaucracy to compel people to do or not to do certain things. In a democracy, we the people theoretically give a government its power through elections. In a dictatorship, state power emerges from the threat of force, not consent of the government. Social norms. What other people think is okay. This exchanges from peer to peer and can change behaviors or laws, such as marriage equality. Ideas. Ideas can generate boundless amounts of energy if it motivates enough people to change their thinking and actions. And numbers. Lots of humans. A vocal mass of people creates power by expressing a collective intensity of interest and by asserting legitimacy. Power is never static. It is always either accumulating or decaying in the civic arena. If you are not taking action, you are being acted upon. Power is like water flowing like a current through everyday life. Politics is the work of harnessing that flow in a direction you would prefer. Policy making is an effort to freeze and perpetuate a particular flow of power. Policy is power frozen in place. The only thing that keeps us from a situation where one person has all of the power is how we apply this knowledge. What rules do we set up so that a few people don't accumulate too much power, and so they can't enshrine their privilege in policy? A social group is a group of people who share a range of physical, cultural, or social characteristics within a social identity category. Here are some examples of social groups within each category. Within each social identity category, some people have greater access to social power and privilege based on membership in their social group. Often, this is called the advantaged group. We call the group whose access to social power is limited or denied the target group. These are what's known as social statuses. This is a wheel of power, and this layout is only accurate to modern American culture. The closer to the center you are, the more power you have. Each person has a number of different characteristics, so where you fall on the chart varies from person to person. Most of these differences in identities are socially constructed. Social construction is an idea that has been created and accepted by the people in a society. When I said this layout is only accurate to modern American culture, that is because social hierarchies vary from culture to culture and can change over time. There are a number of matriarchal societies in the world. Indonesia has the largest, with about 4.2 million members. But there is also Costa Rica, China, Ghana, Kenya, and India. In some cultures, queer people are treated as gods. The ancient Egyptians had their deities. The Hindu and indigenous people celebrate their two-spirited individuals. Several cultures give more respect and more power to the elderly than we do here. The Greeks. Indigenous peoples celebrate their elders. In Korea, in China, and ancient Rome. In the Middle Ages, being larger showed you were a person of means, which usually translated into wealth and power. And in some cultures today, like in Fiji, view being larger as more attractive. In these cultures, placements on the wheel are different because their social hierarchies are different. Privilege exists when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of the groups they belong to rather than because of anything they've done or failed to do. Access to privilege doesn't determine someone's outcome, but it is definitely an asset that makes it more likely that whatever talent, ability, and aspiration a person with privilege has will result in something positive for them. Determining who has privilege or disadvantage is complex because cultural, social, and historical changes affect which groups are privileged and which groups are not. Sometimes being family gives you privilege. Sometimes being white gives you privilege. Some may pass as members of an advantaged group. For example, some people may change their names to protect themselves from discrimination. Some people may be given privilege because they were assumed to be members of an advantaged group. For example, a bisexual person in an opposite-sex relationship may be assumed to be heterosexual and thus treated differently. Being a straight passing gay may afford certain comforts. And just like power, having privilege is not inherently bad. It's how you utilize it and how others are impacted by it that you must vigilantly attend to. Oppression is a system that maintains advantage and disadvantage based on social group memberships and operates, intentionally and unintentionally, on individual, institutional, and cultural levels. Individual oppression is when attitudes and actions reflect prejudice against a social group, unintentional and intentional. Institutional oppression would be policies, laws, rules, norms, and customs enacted by organizations and social institutions that disadvantage some social groups and advantage other social groups intentionally and unintentionally. And societal or cultural oppression would be social norms, roles, rituals, language, music, and art that reflect and reinforce the belief that one social group is superior to another intentionally and unintentionally. There are 4 levels to racism: internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and systemic. Internalized racism is when, either knowing it or not, someone has negative ideas about themselves and their race or culture. Interpersonal racism is when an individual shows negative ideas or actions towards another race or culture not their own. All types of people have these attitudes regardless of their own race. Institutional racism is the laws and practices that institutions create in order to benefit white people at the expense of people of color. Institutional racism is different from interpersonal or internalized racism because it does not just affect one person, it affects large groups of people at once. Systemic racism is ongoing racial inequalities that are maintained by society. The outcome of these policies and practices always have a negative effect on people of color. An example of institutional racism in the cannabis industry can be seen with the barring of those who have records from becoming license holders because of the way Black and brown communities have been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. Classism can also be found at individual, institutional, and cultural levels. Individual classism can be reflected by middle-class people calling thrift store clothes tacky, feeling the reason people are poor is because they're lazy or stupid, assuming that everyone can afford or feel comfortable going to an expensive restaurant, believing a certain kind of work is beneath them, and referring to groups of people as lowlives. Institutional classism can be seen in different ways, like hospitals keeping privately insured patients for an adequate amount of time, more so than others because they're good for it. Schools in poor neighborhoods have fewer resources and larger student-teacher ratios than wealthy neighborhoods, Because money for schools is based on local property taxes. Colleges giving preference to legacy children of alumni, making it harder for first-generation college applicants to get in. And employers expecting that all employees have smartphones for work schedules. An anti-homeless architecture like strips and spikes. Cultural classism could be seen through the media buzz that surrounds royal weddings but not your neighbors. And TV shows and movies that portray poor people and working class people as idiots, like in The Simpsons and Schitt's Creek. While discussing power, privilege, and oppression within cannabis, we must acknowledge the war on drugs. The war on drugs has been a misinformed and racist government campaign that continues to result in the criminalization of millions of Americans, and has had global, long-lasting impacts. When Richard Nixon started the war on drugs in 1971, the prison population was 200,000. Right now, there are about 2 million people in prisons and jails in the United States, more than any other country in the world. This mass incarceration has affected generations of people, especially people of color, and the war on drugs still rages on today. Although the rates of drug use and sales are similar, regardless of race or ethnicity, Black and Latino people are far more likely to be criminalized than white people. A 2020 ACLU research report found that Black people are 3.64 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession. In every single state, Black people are more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. And in some states, Black people were up to 6, 8, or almost 10 times more likely to be arrested. There were more marijuana arrests in 2018 than in 2015, despite the fact that 8 states legalized cannabis for recreational use or decriminalized cannabis possession in that time. The U.S. Census Bureau of Justice Statistics found that 1 in 9 Black children have an incarcerated parent, compared to 1 in 28 Latino children and 1 in 57 white children. 1 in 13 Black people of voting age are denied the right to vote because of laws that disenfranchise people with felony convictions. Nearly 80% of people in federal prison and almost 60% of people in state prison for drug offenses are Black or Latino. The war on drugs has also inflamed another situation globally. The report of the Global Commission on Drug Policy found that the war on drugs fuels the global HIV pandemic. While the annual number of new infections has been falling since the late 1990s, HIV increased by more than 25% in 7 countries over this time span, largely as a result of HIV transmission related to intravenous drug use. 5 of these countries are in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, where the war on drugs is being aggressively fought, and as a result, the number of people living with HIV in this part of the world has almost tripled since 2000. Throughout the world, research has consistently shown us that repressive drug law enforcement practices and the fear of arrests drive users away from public health services and into environments where HIV risk becomes more elevated. Mass incarceration of nonviolent drug offenders also plays a major role in increasing HIV risks. In many countries, including the United States, HIV prevalence behind bars are many times higher than among the general population. 1/4 of all HIV-positive Americans are estimated to pass through correctional facilities every year. High rates of incarceration among drug users with HIV or at risk of HIV infection are a matter of deep concern, given that incarceration has been associated with syringe sharing, unprotected sex, and HIV outbreaks in many places around the world. Incarceration has been identified as a risk factor for acquiring HIV infection in countries of Western and Southern Europe, Russia, Canada, Brazil, Iran, and Thailand. Research has shown that the sharing of used syringes is the primary reason for the spread of HIV in prison settings. Incarceration also drives the risk of HIV infection and disease by interrupting antiretroviral HIV treatment. Without medication, the virus can be transmissible. The global emphasis on drug law enforcement has also led to mass incarceration of drug users in compulsory drug detention centers, particularly in places where HIV is spreading rapidly amongst its population. Reports consistently indicate that these facilities fail to offer evidence-based addiction treatments or HIV care. Documented cases of forced labor, torture, and other human rights abuses are widespread in these settings. Compulsory drug detention centers continue to operate, especially in China and Southeast Asia. And even outside of the prison system, the war on drugs is still creating a terrible impact on HIV in other ways. Prohibitions on treatment make treatment harder to get. Russia has rejected evidence-based HIV prevention methods and has made the use of methadone illegal. And this is how their HIV transmission rates are looking. Thailand's HIV among sex workers has dropped dramatically since the widespread promotion of condoms and evidence-based approaches. But they're still incredibly hard on drugs, and HIV rates amongst injection users is growing. In Switzerland, the government responded to the growing HIV epidemic among injection users in the 1980s by implementing innovative policies that provided clean syringes, supervised injection facilities, easily accessible methadone therapy, heroin prescription, and antiretroviral treatment. This strategy has led to a reduction in the number of new HIV infections linked to drug infection, from about 68% in 1985 to about 15% in 1997 and about 5% in 2009. Likewise, British Columbia's approach has involved antiretroviral therapy, opioid substitution, syringe distribution, and medically supervised injection facilities, which resulted in the declining of HIV and AIDS deaths among intravenous drug users. So what do we need to do? We need to decriminalize drug possession, removing a major cause of arrest and incarceration of primarily people of color, helping more people to receive drug treatment, and redirecting law enforcement resources to prevent serious and violent crime. We need to eliminate policies that result in disproportionate arrests and incarceration rates by changing police practices, rolling back harsh mandatory minimum sentences, and repealing sentencing disparities. We need to end policies that exclude people with a record from key rights and opportunities. This includes voting, employment, public housing, loans, financial aid, child custody, and more. We need equity programs to support the communities most impacted by the war on drugs. Washington State is a bit complicated. While we were one of the first states to legalize, equity was not on their minds. Institutions and individuals with greater access to capital moved in and took over, making our Washington market very white. But there are newer efforts to make a better difference. There is now a Washington State Justice and Equity Cannabis Commission working to help reallocate licenses to communities most impacted by the war on drugs. There's a Justice and Equity Committee of the Cannabis Alliance that has been working on expungement fairs to assist people through the process. Around the country, there are also a lot of really incredible organizations like the Last Prisoner Project, Supernova Women, and the National Diversity in Cannabis Association. Some additional things that you can do would be to really reflect and understand the power in your daily life. Map out who has what kind of power, in what systems. Understand why it turned out this way, who made it so, and who wants to keep it so. Speak up in a voice that's authentic. Advocate for the marginalized. Organize your ideas, then organize other people. Get involved with organizations already doing equity work. Now that we've gone through these systems and injustices, make sure you stay alert and think about how they may manifest in your workplace and in the industry.